Hi everyone, my name is Ashley Halliday Schmidt, and I'm the director of the Northwest Michigan Coalition to End Homelessness. This training is being brought to you by the Coalition, and we'll be giving a brief overview of what the Coalition is and really an in-depth view of the homeless response system. And it's really targeted for folks new to the work to end homelessness and who are working for a provider within the Coalition. So, the coalition in general is a collaboration of agencies and entities all working together across Northwest Michigan to end homelessness. The mission of the coalition is to make homelessness rare, brief, and one time across Northwest Michigan. And the vision is really where every community across Northwest Michigan is thriving, meaning where all people in a community and experiencing homelessness have access to a variety of housing solutions and supports to effectively end their experience of homelessness. What we actually do at the coalition, or really what the role of the staffing at the coalition, is to oversee the general strategy and vision of the work to end homelessness across providers within the coalition. We also oversee some of the state and federal funding that comes into our region for the work to end homelessness. Other funding opportunities as well are part of the coalition staff to, or under their role to bring in more funding. We measure all of the programs and all of the outcomes associated with each of the programs funded to end homelessness. Our work is within advocacy and building public will, both like publicly and with elected officials around our work, and then to implement best practices for the work to end homelessness. The coalition also plays a critical function as the continuum of care. So you can find more information about this on HUD.gov, on HUD's website. But essentially, the way communities get funding to end homelessness and for that work is through the federal and state government. At the federal level, HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, has sectioned off states into local jurisdictions. And those jurisdictions could be a single county, a single city, even, or a geographic area within a state. Our state has all three of those. So in our state, there are, I believe, 20 continuums of care. So 20 jurisdictions that receive money directly from HUD to do this work. Our jurisdiction or continuum of care is the Northwest Michigan Coalition to End Homelessness. It's made up of the 5-county region of Antrim, Benzie, Grand Traverse, Kalkaska, and Leelanau counties. So all of our reporting is inclusive of those counties and the communities within those counties. Anything outside of that is a different continuum of care or a different jurisdiction within our state. So a continuum of care is in place really to be the place to get the funding, the allocation point for the federal government funding. Promotes community-wide commitment of the goal to end homelessness. We talked about the funding, and then really making sure that there's a homeless response system led by best practices covering all of the entities within a jurisdiction. So a little bit confusing, but I really wanted to ground us in, we didn't just make up this coalition. We need to have, in order to get federal and state dollars, we need to have this continuum of care in each region, and ours is the coalition. So 4 pillars really stand up our coalition, which is to have a service delivery system dedicated to collaboration, data-driven decision-making, and equity. We have educated, dedicated staff who practice from a housing first philosophy. You've heard about the housing first philosophy and some other coalition-wide trainings. And then we have backbone staff who help build public will, gain community support, and guide the overall vision. So when you hear us talk about backbone staff, that's talking about the coalition level staff. So myself, Jace, our data analyst, and any other support level staff at the coalition level. And then we have streamlined funding, all dedicated to the work to end homelessness. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean when we say ending homelessness. Now, hopefully, as a prerequisite to this training, you've watched the Road Away from Homelessness training, and that, or I'm sorry, video, and that really grounds us in this. But what we mean when we say end homelessness is not that people will never experience homelessness again in a community. Likely, people will always fall in and out of homelessness in any given community. What we want to see is homelessness becoming rare, brief, and one time. So if homelessness occurs, we want to make sure it doesn't happen very often or it's rare. We want to make sure it's brief so that if someone falls into homelessness, they're quickly getting out of it and becoming housed again. And then it's one time. So when someone falls into homelessness, we quickly get them rehoused and they stay housed and they never experience homelessness again. And we measure that through, I will show you an inflow and outflow tool, but really what it means is, do we have more people exiting homelessness than we have entering? And we do that through our data. This is just a 1 month look at this of May 2024. And so you can see of the number of people we have experiencing homelessness in our community that's actively homeless. That's the number in the middle, 248. Right now, or in May of 2024, there were 248 people experiencing homelessness. In the month of May, we had 19 people leave homelessness, and that is depicted in the outflow. So we had 13 of those 19 go to a housing placement, and that's what we want to see. We want to see high numbers there. And then 6 people became inactive. And really what we mean when we say inactive is sometimes, because homelessness is sometimes transient, people might choose to leave our community and go somewhere else, or because we don't have a way to contact them, they may leave the community and we don't know where they went. So they became inactive that way. They could have went to a long-term institutional setting as well, and then they would be counted as inactive. For our inflow, we're always measuring how many people came into homelessness that month. And in May, we had 41. That's very high. Usually we don't have that high of a number, but in this example, we do. And of those 41, 33 were new to homelessness. So that means they had not experienced homelessness in the past 2 years or potentially ever in their life. And then 8 were returning. So they had experienced homelessness in the past 2 years and were coming back into homelessness. So if we think about our measures again, our rare, brief, and one time, and we need to have more people exiting than we have entering, let's see if any of those things are true. So I wouldn't necessarily call 248 people experiencing homelessness in a relatively low populated area as it becoming rare. Here in rare, we would see something a little more manageable, probably under 100 people would be a number that would be really manageable for our community. We would also see the outflow number much higher than the inflow. So we'd have, maybe you'd reverse that, right? You'd see 41 people leaving in May and only 19 entering. Likely we want to see those numbers much lower of inflow as well, but we weren't hitting that. And then one time, was that true? No, because we have an inflow of returning folks. So if we really want to see our number of folks returning to homelessness right at 0. And that's not, we can't control everything, but we want to see that much lower than 8. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about what the coalition does and what the coalition staff does, and also what a continuum of care is, we're going to get into the homeless response system. So the homeless response system is where we talk about providing access to emergency services for people experiencing homelessness, providing them access and intake services, and then how they get out of homelessness. And the things that make that up are having a call center or a way to really access services. That can also be done through street outreach. We have a program specifically related to helping people problem solve ways out of homelessness who might have other options. And we do that through shelter diversion and rapid exit. We also have temporary emergency shelter. We know that we're not going to be able to prevent homelessness in every single instance. Remember a few slides back, we talked about probably not ever going to have zero people ever experiencing homelessness in a community. So while people wait for access to housing, we need to have a safety net there, and that's what temporary emergency shelter is. We also have programming called rapid rehousing. In a very high functioning homeless response system, your rapid rehousing programs will be focused at people who, or targeted toward people who don't need a lot of assistance. They don't need long-term permanent supportive housing in order to end their experience of homelessness. They might need short-term rental assistance and a little bit of support, but then they'll be able to access and maintain their housing with very little or kind of mid-level support from the homeless response system. And then permanent supportive housing is for our most acute and likely our chronically homeless population. That is our population of folks experiencing homelessness for a year or longer and who have a diagnosed disability. And within that population, we see pretty severe needs of folks because they've been experiencing homelessness for long periods of time, and their needs just become exacerbated over time and during their experience of homelessness, that we need to wrap around them with lots of support services once they become housed. And we'll talk about each of these components next. So we'll start with our call center. Our call center is operated by the Northwest Michigan Community Action Agency, and the purpose is to provide access to the services and supports available for people experiencing homelessness to end their homelessness as quickly as possible. And I should have prefaced this whole homeless response system conversation with the definitions of homelessness, but I'll do that now. So the definition of homelessness that we're talking about in all of our work are people experiencing literal homelessness. So HUD has determined literal homelessness to mean people experiencing street homelessness or people who are living in temporary emergency shelters, hotels or motels paid for by charitable or government organizations, and folks who are exiting an institution who stayed there less than 90 days and were also homeless prior to that. So a lot of words there, but what we're really getting at is people who are experiencing literal, actual homelessness, meaning they're sleeping on the streets, they're sleeping in vehicles, they are sleeping in other places not meant for humans to live in, or they are residing in shelters as they wait for housing. That's the very basic definition of this. And so we need, as people fall into homelessness, we need a way for them to access the services available to them to end their experience of homelessness. And we do that through the call center. So we have a toll-free number, 844-900-0500. Folks can also email homelessness@nmcaa.net, prevention, housing questions, or youth. And we do this, we have this email option because sometimes people don't have a phone, but they do have access to another service provider in the community. And what that service provider can do is email our call center and say, hey, can we set up a time? You know, my client's going to be in my office. I know they're experiencing homelessness. They're going to be in my office at 3:00 tomorrow. Can we set up a time to talk to someone in your call center? And that's how we use the email option for that. The main role of the call center, like I said, is to provide access to the homelessness response system. We want to make sure, though, that people gaining access to the system, the supports, actually need those supports. many people call our call center every day and every year, who don't actually end up entering our system. And that's a good thing. The more people, if as long as we're providing adequate access, we know that the only predictor of long-term and chronic homelessness is ever becoming homelessness in the ever becoming homeless in the first place. If we can prevent someone from entering our system and access supports outside of our system to stay housed, that is better for not only our system, but most importantly, the person. Homelessness is very difficult to get out of. So when we can prevent it, we want to at all costs. And so what the call center staff are doing are really problem solving and doing a level of triage, making sure, okay, the person does need emergency shelter, for example, making sure they have nowhere else to go. And if they're not identifying something, or even if they are identifying something, they're going to work with them to access that, rather than entering the homeless response system. They'll also make a referral based on the client's needs to the next appropriate service. Usually that's going to look like diversion services, where they get a little bit more intensive support to help problem solve out of homelessness before really entering the system. They also get access to temporary emergency shelter if they need it, and if beds are available, the call center will help triage those calls. And then referrals to street outreach. Those usually happen through diversion services, but once in a while, folks will call the call center who just really need the referral right to street outreach. And then the call center can also place people on the MSHDA Housing Choice Voucher waiting list with homeless preference, if we can prove that the person is actually experiencing literal homelessness. There's trainings related to that as well. This is just kind of that high level overview of what the call center does. Next, we'll talk about street outreach. Street outreach used to have, the role of street outreach used to be receiving referrals directly from the call center. Now we have an added layer of support between the call center and kind of the system. It's not to prevent people from accessing shelter. What it's doing is, as people are either in shelter or waiting for emergency shelter beds to open up, we have someone actively pursuing other options with them, in case those are viable. And so we're actually going to talk about that first. So from the call center, most calls are going to be referred right to shelter diversion. Like I said, we're trying to help people understand what caused a person's housing crisis, and explore what immediate solutions to the crisis may be possible, and then help them pursue that. So for example, if someone is calling the call center and saying, I really need a shelter bed tonight, I have nowhere else to go, the call center might say something like, where did you stay last night? Talk about where they stayed last night. Maybe that could lead to a conversation about where they stayed the night before that, and the night before that, and the night before that. And then potentially somewhere down the line, they might identify that they in fact do have somewhere else to stay other than emergency shelter. So in that case, the diversion worker can actually help the client access housing at whatever location that is. Sometimes that even requires temporary financial assistance from the homeless response system to get a bus ticket back to, let's say the person has an aunt in Florida, that's safe and appropriate. The diversion worker can help vet that situation out and make sure it's safe and appropriate, and help pay for the person to actually get back down to aunt, where they're more supported and not experiencing homelessness. So if you think of shelter diversion away from the homeless response system when safe and appropriate, not as a barrier to getting into shelter. So next, we'll talk about street outreach. Our street outreach team provides services and supports to people experiencing homelessness in our community. They're focused on serving people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, usually to find solutions to end their homelessness. So street outreach workers are primarily working on housing with those are already connected and actively engaged, meaning they're experiencing literal homelessness, typically even chronic homelessness. They're trying to get all of their documents together, like an ID, a birth certificate, all of the things that you need in order to get into housing. That's what outreach workers are working on with folks, so that when a housing slot opens up through the prioritization process, this person's document ready, and they're ready to just kind of fill out the application and have all their supporting documents ready. Outreach is also working on engagement of people who are service resistant. So people who have a difficult time engaging with systems, they're helping those folks get access to our system when they really need it. And then finally, they're working on identification about 10% of the time. And identification is really talking about looking out in the community for people who are experiencing homelessness. They know kind of hotspots or places where people experiencing unsheltered homelessness regularly stay, and they're seeking out those locations to provide access to the homeless response system to those folks. Next, we'll talk about temporary emergency shelter. And the purpose of this is to provide a safe place for people experiencing homelessness to stay as they work to end their homelessness. Temporary emergency shelter is not the final destination for people experiencing homelessness. It's sometimes a stop along the way. In order to get into housing programs, folks do not have to access emergency shelter, but they can if they need it and want it. Shelter is not appropriate for every single person, every single night. Folks who we serve are experiencing a significant amount of trauma, and sometimes that can be exacerbated by living among 50 to 60 people on any given night who are also struggling. So sometimes folks don't access every night, but it's there if they need to. The providers of this service are Safe Harbor, the women in the winter months, Women's Resource Center for people, women experiencing and fleeing from domestic violence, and then Goodwill of Northern Michigan, who operates the Goodwill Inn. The 5 keys to effective emergency shelter are to be really aligned with the housing first perspective. And in order to do that, usually shelters need to be immediate and have low barrier access. So ensuring immediate access to shelter by lowering barriers, staying open 24/7, eliminating sobriety and income requirements, and other policies that make it difficult to enter shelter and difficult to stay in shelter while folks work to access housing. Effective emergency shelter also has safe and appropriate diversion embedded within it. So let's say someone through the diversion process has not been able to identify anyone else that they could stay with and needed to enter the homeless response system and stay in a shelter bed. Let's pretend that person on day 16 of staying in shelter identified someone they could go back and stay with. We've really planted the seed early on with our diversion services through the call center and through the shelter diversion program that, okay, maybe you haven't identified anything today, but even after you enter shelter, if something else comes up, let us know so that we can rapidly get you out of shelter and where it is more safe and appropriate for you to be. Shelters should also be housing focused and have those rapid exit support services attached to them. Now, different shelters have different levels of capacity. It's also, if you're serving a subpopulation like people experiencing domestic violence, a lot more goes into that related to safety concerns. But in general terms, shelters should be housing focused. What do you need to exit our shelter and become housed? Shelters should not be looking at how do we keep people temporarily housed for as long as possible. We need to provide temporary housing and shelter, emergency shelter, but it always needs to be focused on how do you permanently exit the shelter. And then we're doing that through looking at data to measure our performance long term. How long are people on average staying at shelter? Are they able to gain low barrier and immediate access to shelter beds available in our community? how many shelter beds do we have available, our utilization rate of those beds, and then finally, how many people are exiting shelter and going into permanent housing. Those are just a few data points that we measure when we look at how effective our shelter system is. Right, next we have rapid rehousing. So in our community, the use of rapid rehousing looks a little bit different. If we, in continuums of care or homeless response systems rather, that have more capacity within housing, rapid rehousing would be used to provide short to medium term rental assistance and support services in home to help people end their experience of homelessness. Rapid rehousing can also be used as a temporary bridge to permanent supportive housing for people who have much higher needs. And so in our system right now, in 2024, we have quite a few people who need long-term permanent supportive housing. And so rapid rehousing is being used to house people quicker and act as a bridge to that permanent supportive housing. But it might not always look like that once we have more housing capacity. So rapid rehousing helps find landlords and apartments for people, helps pay for housing and connect people once they become housed to the jobs and services to stay in housing. And why you'll see the word jobs here in rapid rehousing, it's because best practices say rapid rehousing is really targeted for people who need that like short to medium term support. And that's just not how we're utilizing this program right now in this community, but that could change over time. And I should say the Northwest Michigan Community Action Agency is the rapid rehousing provider in our community. And then finally, we have permanent supportive housing. And permanent supportive housing, or PSH, is there to provide lifetime rental assistance and supports to people who are experiencing chronic homelessness, meaning they've been homeless for a year or longer and have a diagnosed disability. Case managers provide in-home case management services and supports for folks once they become housed. And this, like I said, could go on for the rest of their life. A lot of times people don't need permanent supportive housing for the rest of their life. And we have moving on programs and voucher programs associated with that. But for folks who do, it is there. This intervention type is for individuals experiencing homelessness for the longest periods of time with the highest degrees of acuity or supports needed to stay housed. And then finally, this is just a look at what the homeless response system could look like for someone kind of going through the system. And we'll give kind of an example of that. So first, an individual becomes homeless. They find themselves facing homelessness. Let's say they told one of our community partners, they stopped into the Salvation Army, for example, to get a clothing voucher. And as they're talking with the staff at Salvation Army, they might say, and I'm living in my car. And so Salvation Army knows, okay, I need to get them connected with the homeless response system. So they provide them with a number. The person living in their car calls the call center, and the call center then attempts to find other options. They do that diversion problem solving conversation that I talked about earlier. If we're not able to divert them, if they're not able to find anything else, the call center will complete a short assessment and still refer them to the next level of support, which is shelter diversion. That team will again give them access to emergency shelter if it's needed and if a bed is available, while they're still working to end their experience of homelessness quickly and safely. Folks are usually matched with a housing navigator. That might be the diversion worker. That might mean a staff at a shelter helping them fill out applications. That might mean a street outreach worker. All of this is dependent on the level of need and how long someone's been homeless. Eventually, we'd like to see everyone get matched with a housing program. And that also happens through a prioritization process that we talk about in another training. And then the person, so once a person is matched with a housing program that meets their needs, the individual moves into housing. And if the person is high acuity or has a lot of service needs, they'll be matched with a housing support service worker once, or a housing-based case manager once they get into housing. It's important to remember that most people who access our homeless response system are able to get out of homelessness within the first year. So 80% of people who access our homeless response system are no longer homeless within that first year, and or within a year, and they've been provided with some level of assistance from our system, but not a lot. That doesn't mean that 80% of people need long-term housing-based case management and subsidy for the rest of their lives. It means our system provided some level of service and they're able to self-resolve within a year. So that's great. And then finally, I'll leave you with this slide. So if you're new to this work, what you really want to remember is that you're not doing this work alone. You have other folks doing this work. Maybe it's a different type of work. But as you can see, there's lots of different providers within our system and lots of different services that we need to have in our community in order to make homelessness rare, brief, and one time. So in order to do that, we really need to rely on each other, trust each other, and hold each other accountable. If we're not doing those things, then it's inherently creating silos within our work, and people serving people that are not aligned with best practices, and we have funding that isn't aligned as effectively and efficiently as it can be. So we need to be making sure we're all acting as if we work for one organization, one team, whose goal is to end homelessness. So if you are new to this work, welcome. I'm sure you'll be hearing my voice a lot through these trainings, and then also through our work groups. We'll be able to meet each other and really get involved and engaged in the work across the coalition. And reach out anytime. My contact information is available at endhomelessnessnmi.org. Thanks and have a great day.